From the nation's highest court could have a big impact on who represents Louisiana in Congress and possibly the balance of power in Washington, D.C. The High Court ruled in favor of black voters in a congressional redistricting case.
It ordered Alabama to redraw its voting maps, and the lines could soon be redrawn here in Louisiana. Good afternoon, I'm Rob Masson.
And I'm Liz Reyes. Conservative Chief Justice John Roberts and Justice Brett Kavanaugh joined with the court's liberal justices, affirming a lower court ruling that Alabama's congressional map violated the Voting Rights Act.
Andres Fuentes joins us with more on how the decision could impact Louisiana voters.
Rob, Liz, members of Louisiana's Legislative Black Caucus believe that this Supreme Court ruling will eventually force the state to add a second majority black congressional district in Louisiana. This ruling orders the creation of such a district in Alabama after a lower court ruling found a violation of the Voting Rights Act with gerrymandered districts. Alabama has only one majority black district out of its 7 districts, despite 1 out of 4 residents being black. Louisiana's congressional maps were also ruled discriminatory by a lower court and remained in effect last year while the Supreme Court put a hold on the case. Now, Fox 8 political analyst Mike Sherman says Louisiana could also see changes, but not as quickly as some might think.
For Louisiana, nothing's going to change quickly, but what it does mean is that the arguments about the Voting Rights Act being upheld and potentially leading to a second majority African-American district are going to find their day in court sometime in the near future.
Now, Governor John Bel Edwards tweeted after the decision saying, quote, "As I said when I vetoed it, Louisiana's congressional maps violates the Voting Rights Act. Louisiana's voting population is 1/3 black." And the governor also says Louisiana can and should have a congressional map where 2 of our 6 districts are majority black. Today's decision reaffirms that. Now, Congressman Troy Carter is now calling on the Louisiana legislature to convene and draw new maps. He says the math is the math and the law requires a second majority minority seat. I've also reached out to the other 5 lawmakers in Louisiana's congressional delegation, and we're waiting on their response to today's decision. Back to you guys on the desk.
All right, Andres, thanks. Well, the Supreme Court's decision has state lawmakers reacting even as they hurry to wrap up work on the budget before today's deadline for ending the session.
Sabrina Wilson joins us live from the state capitol with more.
Yeah, a lot of talk about that. Members of the Legislative Black Caucus are thrilled over the U.S. Supreme Court's ruling, and they think it will lead to a second majority black district here in Louisiana. But lawmakers who voted to keep just one are not convinced. With little time left in this legislative session, state lawmakers are trying to finish work on critical pieces of legislation. But a lot of lawmakers are also talking about that U.S. Supreme Court ruling, which orders the state of Alabama to create another black majority district. That's what Governor Edwards and civil rights advocates and Democratic state lawmakers fought for last year when it was time for the Louisiana legislature to redraw the state's congressional district maps. But the Republican-controlled legislature rejected that idea, deciding to keep the single black majority district Louisiana has, even though federal Judge Shelley Dick long ago said the state should have 2 African-American majority districts due to the black population in Louisiana. Now, I spoke to lawmakers on both sides of the issue.
Well, the Supreme Court ruling was absolutely huge. The Supreme Court confirmed what we already knew. Certainly great implications for Alabama, but Louisiana as well. The Middle District of Louisiana has the case sitting on their desk. I fully expect that Louisiana will have a second majority minority district.
We are a long ways from knowing that answer to that question. You know, we have a 100-page ruling from the U.S. Supreme Court that everyone is still trying to digest. We're very confident that the maps that we passed are in compliance with the Constitution and with the Voting Rights Act. And, we look forward, every case is different, and so we look forward to continuing the process in the Louisiana courts to have our maps heard.
the budget for the new fiscal year is still being worked on at this hour because the budget passed by the State House isn't to the governor's liking or that of the State Senate. However, both chambers did agree to raise the spending limit and, of course, some bills that will provide grants to homeowners to fortify their roofs against hurricanes and also provide more money for an insurance incentive fund. Those have done well here at the state capitol. Reporting live from the state capitol in Baton Rouge, I'm Sabrina Wilson, Fox 8 Local 1.